Our podcast sponsor today is strategytraining.com. If you want to strengthen your strategy skills, you can get the overall approach used in well-managed strategy studies. It's a free download, and you can go to firmsconsulting.com/overall approach. That's firmsconsulting with an s.com/overall approach. And if you're looking to advance your career and need to update your resume, you can get a McKinsey and BCG winning resume template as a free download at www.firmsconsulting.com/resume PDF. That's www.firmsconsulting.com/resume PDF. Hey, Eugene, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here.
Thank you for inviting me. It's my pleasure to be here.
So I was really looking forward in speaking to you when your profile came across my desk, because I am personally interested in healthcare and specifically the way hospitals are managed. Now, I've only had one opportunity to interact with the American healthcare system because I'm not American. But from everything I've heard, people always complain about hospitals in America. How bad is it?
Let me explain it to you.
Please.
First of all, I would not say that it's just America. What happens to the hospital, I would call it like international plot against the healthcare.
Oh, I like because a mystery.
The same, what I'm going to say is true for every country. It's true for Canada. It's true for UK. It's true for Europe. It's true for Middle East. You name it. So I would not be able to list all the problems that hospitals experience today.
Well, let's give us the big ones.
Yeah, let me give you the big ones, a few big ones. Emergency departments are overcrowded.
Okay.
I can tell you in Canada, for example, they're periodically closed. So the people have to drive, the sick people have to drive to the hospitals, 100 kilometers from where they live, because the nearby hospital closed the emergency department for a while. The next one internationally is nurse shortage. That practically all the countries experience that. The third one I would name, it's healthcare cost, obviously. The hospitals are being squeezed. Healthcare, at least in the US, dozens of years ago, used to be cost plus reimbursed.
Yes.
Not anymore. So the hospitals have still the mindset that has been developed years ago and under financial pressure today. Let me describe the hospital operations, not necessarily, again, the US.
Yes.
It's the same true for many other countries. What I, learning, and we work, our institute, non-for-profit Institute for Healthcare Optimization, where I'm a CEO, working with hospitals, helping them to address those issues on a regular basis. And the more I learn, the more experience I have. That reminds me of the story, like an old gentleman was going to marry, and he asked his wife-to-be, he told his wife-to-be, I have to be honest with you. I have a problem with my knees. I have a problem with my back. I have a problem with my vision. She interrupted him and said, tell me what you don't have. And he said, teeth. So that describes what is going on today at the hospitals.
So you made a point here that it's happening all over the world, not just in the United States. What has changed in healthcare that has caused this? Has something changed in the last few decades?
First and foremost, I would say that no country that could afford rapidly growing healthcare costs. In the US, for example, this year, if I'm not mistaken, it's between 4.8 and 4.9 billion. Trillion. 4.8, 4.9 trillion. That's a huge amount of money. 1/3 of this typically is being spent for the hospitals. So what I would say that the main problem is that the hospitals are no longer healthcare reimbursed.
Yes.
And it's very difficult to change the mentality. If I tell you, for example, that your salary is going to be 10 million a year, and you live like that for a while. But then I say, okay, starting tomorrow, it's going to be 100,000. I'm exaggerating to make my point. 100,000 is still, livable amount of money. But you're not used to this amount of money, and your spending habit remains the same. So that is the problem, that the hospitals are under significant pressure. Second reason, I remember very well, 20, 30 years ago, the hospitals were firing nurses in order to save money when HMO penetrated the market, health maintenance organizations penetrated the market and started controlling the healthcare costs. The hospitals were looking, where can we save? And nurses is significant, expenses for the hospital. Even now, when we have fewer nurses and cannot afford staffing on a high level to the patient demand, even now it exceeds conservatively 50% of the overall hospital budget.
Wait, let me just unpack that for a second. Did I hear that correctly, that the labor cost for nurses is 50% of the budget?
At least.
At least.
At least.
That's a big number.
It's a big number. And what happened many years ago? It was much more. So if you look at the hospital bed occupancy, it reminds EKG with the alternating peaks and valleys.
Yes.
So again, dozens of years ago, we used to staff at the peak level. Not anymore. We cannot afford it anymore. So the hospital, for two reasons. First of all, we don't have resources. Again, even now, we don't have resources when we staff approximately on the level of average demand. We still don't have resources. It's 50% plus of the hospital budget. But those good times when we were able to staff at the peak are gone. So the hospitals, when they staff based on the average demand, they experience problems. So whenever a patient bed occupancy, the number of patients that occupied hospital beds, whenever it is greater than the staffing level, it has been documented in dozens and dozens of scientific studies. You experience nursing burnout, shortage, medical errors, mortality, readmissions, practically everything. So that's a problem that every hospital experiences today. And what happened to the nurses, by the way? If you are subjected to excessive workload, what would you do about that?
You quit.
If you're a nurse, you would start demanding adequate patient per nurse staffing ratio. For example, it has been documented over 20 years ago that for surgical post-operative patients, the good, safe, I should say, number of patient per nurse is 4. Practically nobody has this, luxurious staffing ratio on the regular surgical floor. So nurses are getting burned out. They're taking care of many more patients than they should. They cannot provide adequate quality of care. Obviously, you're running this podcast, you're host of this podcast. What if somebody would ask you to simultaneously host another podcast at the same time as we talk? Would not be possible for you. The same is true for nurses. They cannot provide adequate care. And what they nurses, how they should react? They're looking at the job outside of the hospitals. They keep demanding nurse staff increasing in patient to nurse staffing ratio. But it does not happen. So they're getting burned out. there were two episodes, if I'm not mistaken, in California, that two nurses committed suicide and attributed that to their burnout.
I have a question, if I may, is to how the listeners follow, and it's also personally interesting to me, right? So we're spending more on healthcare in the United States, big numbers, 4 or 5 trillion. You mentioned that nursing used to be a bigger portion of the labor cost. It's now around 50%. At the same time, we have fewer nurses per a patient, so the ratios are big, fewer nurses caring for more patients. So if all these costs are being borne by customers, we're all paying more every year. And if this money is not going to nurses, where is the money going?
First of all, let me try to explain. That's a very good question, thank you. Why does it happen? The very important contributor are baby boomers.
Baby boomers.
Absolutely. I'm one of them.
You're one of them, so you're an expert.
Yeah, I'm the guilty party. Yeah.
You're guilty as charged. So how are baby boomers driving this boom in healthcare costs?
Yes, but it's not it. I can tell you that COVID contributed a lot to that. So many nurses were leaving profession.
Okay.
Some of them because of the workload, some of them because they didn't want to be vaccinated, some of them were concerned about bringing infection into their families, etc., etc. So, and then what nurses learn, that there are other places to work for them. They could work at the school, they could work somewhere else, they could retire. Many nurses who were not planning to retire, COVID prompted them to retire. And that is why we have national growing shortage of nurses. And now, what else they were doing? That's an interesting effect. If you're a nurse and you work with your peers in a particular floor, and one of your colleagues going to the nursing agency and becoming traveling nurse. So they are paid much more than you do, at least twice. And she does the same. She comes back to your hospital. She's next to you, doing what she was doing yesterday and being paid twice. What would you do? You would follow her footsteps. So more and more nurses went to this company for traveling nurses, being hired as travelers. And that is much more expensive for the hospitals. The hospitals cannot afford it. So when the nurses ask for adequate patient per nurse staffing ratio, frequently that results in finger pointing, saying that the hospital C-suite, they don't care about nurses, they don't do what they should do, and they should provide adequate number of nurses. They can't. They can't because they cannot afford, and they cannot make nurses out of the thin air. You have shortage of nurses and shortage of funds. In this environment, they simply cannot deliver.
You mentioned boomers. How are boomers linked to this?
People live longer and they're becoming acutely ill. And, the older is the person, the more acute this person likely to be. So their diagnosis, their diseases taken longer to stay at the hospital, typically.
So I'm just unpacking these things for the audience, right? So the whole healthcare system is trying to keep people living longer, but the longer they live, the more likely they are to have problems, and this takes up time and capital and the time of nurses in the hospital system.
Yeah.
Oh, I can imagine how bad it must be in Japan then.
Yeah, correct. And they do have shortage of nurses in Japan. They do have this problem acutely. Now, if you compare a baby boomer with 20 years old, who also happened to be admitted to the hospital for whatever reason, you understand that their level of acuity and the length of stay and the resources they require would be very different typically.
And this is interesting. When we started the discussion, I had assumed that we would be talking about the rising cost of medicine the rising costs of doctors' salaries and the advent of private equity getting involved in hospitals. But are these not the main drivers?
I cannot say so. There are other drivers among those, every one that you mentioned.
Yes.
It's first of all, it's new medication that are expensive, and everybody wants to get the most, effective one, and it happens to be the last one that costs money. Second, it's medical technology, different equipment that keeps growing and asks for more and more resources. However, while we mention all this, I would say, quote unquote, legitimate expenses, there is a waste. And the waste, let me quote a couple of numbers. I happened to serve in 2012 on the Institute of Medicine, now it's the National Academy of Medicine Committee on the Future of United States Healthcare. And we found that probably 25 plus, everybody, when I quote 25% waste, then those who, health policy analysts, prominent people in the US, they told me that I'm underestimating that.
Yes.
So, but let me underestimate.
Let's do it.
Let's say it's 25%. 25% of the healthcare cost waste, if we spend today 4.8 trillion, we are talking about 1.2 trillion waste.
Waste. W-A-S-T-E.
Waste, correct.
Waste.
And I can tell you, this waste is greater than the overall, I believe last year, don't quote me on that, but I'm almost certain that I'm correct. The overall expenses on the military budget, defense budget in the US was less than 1 trillion.
Yeah, I think it was 880 billion last year.
Yeah, so we are wasting more than entire military consumes.
That's a shocking statistic.
And what do we get for this money? Okay, let us look what different sources quote different numbers. The one that I'm familiar with is between 250,000 and 440,000 avoidable deaths per year.
That's a big number. But break down the waste for me. How are we defining waste here?
There's expenses that could be avoided.
Okay, expenses that could be avoided.
Extra paperwork, but I'm not an expert in other types of waste.
Sure.
I'm more familiar with the area where I'm working, is the waste due to mismanagement of operations.
Yes. So when you say operations, you mean the general running of a hospital?
Yes, and to be more specific is patient flow. The patient comes to the hospital either for surgery or for emergency.
Yes.
Care, and then the person, travels through the hospital from emergency, potentially to intensive care, and then potentially to the regular medical ward, then to discharge, going home, etc. So this patient journey through the hospital is patient flow, and this is what is definitely mismanaged at the vast majority of the hospitals.
So just unpack things for the listeners, right? The one issue is the significant nursing labor costs, which are at least 50%, but they have come down from 10, 20 years ago. It used to be higher than 50%.
It wasn't higher. Look, you know that when you have a demand capacity equation, when the demand significantly greater than capacity,
yes,
then the cost of this, I shouldn't say product, whatever we are talking about, goes up.
Yeah, for the listeners, it's a classic problem. If you look at an airport, for example, when you build an airport, you build it to manage peak traffic. Yeah. But that peak traffic doesn't last the whole day. It may last for only 10% of the day. And you've got the rest of the facility, which is basically just there doing nothing. And I'm assuming a hospital would have the exact same problem. And you've got to manage, is it not the same?
Not necessarily.
But it does happen.
It does happen, but at the hospital, it's worse
It's
than at
worse.
the
Why is it worse?
Let me try to explain it. Imagine that you are going in February when it's cold. I do not know which country you're talking from.
Okay, let's imagine. Yeah, it's cold in February.
Yeah, it's cold. Yeah. So February, you're driving on the 3 or 4 lane highway to the place where you would like to be in the hot day. So, and let's describe it, this scenario as February, 2 o'clock in the morning on the 3 lane highway. You're driving to the sea, ocean, forest, whatever you like. Again, it sounds like a crazy scenario, but I'm doing that for a reason.
Okay.
And suppose that on one of the lanes at that time, 2 o'clock in the morning in February, you see a car accident. And the cars are being surrounded by police, ambulance, etc. Again, 3 to 4 lanes highway. How it would affect your driving time to your point of destination?
Gonna make it longer.
Only if you're curious.
Yes.
Because there are 3 to 4 lanes and nobody else on the highway at that time.
But most people tend to be curious.
Okay, then it would. Now, imagine the same scenario, 10 o'clock in the morning, August or July, on Saturday. So you have a very dense traffic. And then any car accident would result in a huge delay. The police would need time to get there, ambulance would need time to get there through the traffic. It would make a significant delay.
Yes.
And that is our hospitals today. We used to staff at the peak of patient demand, of bed occupancy, of number of patients occupying the beds. Sometime I was surprised to learn that historically, sometimes we staff even above the potential peak. Now, we are overflown. So it's practically this Saturday, July or August, 10 o'clock in the morning scenario. When you have a dense traffic, you cannot unload it very quickly.
Well, let me unpack this for the listeners, right? So what you're saying is that the hospitals are now working past their peak all the time?
Many, I would say most of them have, I shouldn't say they work all the time. That's not true. But most of them, they do have peak that hit the ceiling of their capacity. That is true. Whether those peaks happen every day, absolutely not. Although if you will talk to the hospital leadership, they will say that they have it every day. No, that's not correct.
But it doesn't change the fact that, as you say, we're sweating these assets significantly if we are running them close or at their peak for more than they were designed to be run at.
They should not be run at the peak, period. It's man-made that they're running at the peak.
So I'm going to ask what's going to seem like an obvious question that I'm sure all your students at Harvard ask you. What is the solution? You can't debottleneck this thing because you can't turn away patients. I'm sure it's not one solution, but what should be the mindset shift that we would need here?
First of all, let me get back to this pattern that hospital bed occupancy, practically every hospital bed occupancy, is the same. It looks like EKG, with peaks and valleys.
Yes.
Then I would ask the question, typically what the healthcare does when healthcare industry faces the problem, it tries to solve this problem. And rarely it addresses the cause of the problem. It just reacts to any problem as it was given, that you cannot get rid of this problem. We have to just manage and address it. Not necessary. What is important to get to the root cause of the problem. So let's try to do it jointly. You have those periodic peaks in bed occupancy. What is the source? What is the cause of those peaks? Let me provide some additional information. Typically, it's not always, but typically, over 50% of all hospital admissions take place through the emergency department. The next big portal to the hospitals are
Yes.
scheduled admissions. Let's say 30%. Those scheduled admissions are mostly surgical, scheduled surgery, but not always. It could be catheterization, etc. So you have again two portals responsible for about 80% of all hospital admissions, more than 80%. The remaining ones are medical referrals, transfers, etc. And if I go on the street and ask a stranger, which one out of these two is the main source cause of those peaks? What do you think would be the answer? They would say that that's probably arriving to the emergency department. We cannot control when people break their legs and come into emergency department, but surgery, scheduled surgery, we can control. It's up to us when to schedule. Again, unscheduled emergency surgery, they're coming through the emergency department. So this 30% are scheduled patient demand. So they would answer this question that the emergency department is a guilty party, so-called, based on the common sense. But the common sense and the healthcare delivery are not always compatible, I have to acknowledge.
Yes.
And in fact, every single hospital that we studied, and we studied this internationally, not just in the United States, we found that the main cause is scheduled admissions.
The main cost is scheduled admissions.
Correct. Very counterintuitive.
Why is that?
Oh, let me explain it to you, but one detail. You can test what I said. You can come to any emergency department at any country. Short of the pandemic, epidemic, or a bus crash in front of the hospital, ask in the emergency department, today is Thursday. 4 or 5 Thursdays from now, how many patients approximately would be admitted to your hospital through your emergency department? Nobody would give you exact number, but they would give you more or less accurate number in every emergency department. They will give you number of patients that they anticipate would come on Thursday. Again, for a given season, and assuming there's no pandemic, epidemic, or a bus crash in front of the hospital. So now let us address your question. Why? Why scheduled admissions are less predictable than our mother nature? I'm not exaggerating. At some hospitals, it is easier to predict when patient would come to the emergency department with a broken leg than when its scheduled surgery would take place.
Now that's very counterintuitive, so I'm going to be interested to see what the reason is.
Yes. Everybody, myself, when I discovered it with my colleague, reacted that this is very bad. But it gives us a glimmer of hope because it's fixable. So, but let me first address why does it happen. A typical, again, it's not different surgeries require different lengths of stay after the surgery, post-surgical. But imagine that you're a surgeon. And typical surgical patient length of stay is about 3 days. If you're a surgeon, which weekday you would prefer to operate? Don't forget that once the surgery is done and before the patient is about to discharge, first of all, you have to visit the patient next day, and the time of discharge, you should visit the patient as well. Not you should, but would be nice.
Yeah,
if you're a
nice.
surgeon going and visit your patient before they discharge home. So which day you would prefer to operate? I can tell you. If you want to spend the weekend with your family, you would prefer to operate Monday and Tuesday. Because by the weekend, your patient will already be discharged. That's it. That's the explanation. So the surgeons prefer to operate at the beginning of the week. And the poor cousin in the emergency department typically is getting overcrowded.
That's the main reason, because the surgeons prefer to front load their surgeries at the beginning of the week. So
Correct.
given the unpredictability of rest time and recovery time, they want to give a few days so they get their weekend off.
Correct.
Wow, they must really like playing golf on the weekend.
Maybe. maybe I should shadow some of them.
There's something I want to point out to people here, because it's very important, right? In a lot of work I've seen across sectors, a lot of issues come down to human behavior and human preferences. And a lot of analysis cannot indicate what human behavior is. All you see is a number. You need to almost be like an anthropologist and watch them for a week and see what they do and why they do it. Because if they explain it to you, they'll try to make it sound very analytic and thoughtful.
Absolutely. I call it forensic pathology.
I love that, forensic pathology.
Yeah.
That's a good one. I must use that.
So let me try to elaborate on that. One may listen to that and say, oh, those bad surgeons, those are greedy guys, and they want to have good time off, etc. I would argue with that. Now, look how surgeons are becoming the victims of this design.
Could you repeat that part? Who's become the victim?
I mentioned emergency patients and the patient themselves, but surgeons and surgical patients becoming the victims of this scheduling system themselves. So if you talk to the surgeons at many hospitals, you will find them complaining on the following.
So they're complaining about it as well.
Absolutely. They don't understand the cause, most of them, but they complain about the outcomes. So what are the outcomes for surgeons? Imagine again that you're surgeons, you schedule your operations, and then the ambulance comes and you cancel it because somebody with ruptured appendicitis should be operated first. So you're being bumped, postponed, or sometimes canceled. If a couple of ambulances come, you cancel. So you wasted your time at the hospital. Your patients were have not eaten since the midnight of the last day.
Yes.
They're hungry, and they are told, oops, you're not going to be operated today. And that could happen more than once.
So patients are getting bumped.
And surgeons.
And surgeons.
Do the surgery. And the surgeons come to the hospitals to do the surgery. And instead, they should wait and do their email. They're very angry when it happens. And it happens on a daily basis.
Yes, because there's a limited number of facilities and support staff. And you've got to pre-book it. You can't just decide the night before you're going to do a surgery. You got to have the anesthesiologist on hand and all the support staff.
Absolutely. So now, suppose that ambulance comes, but all operating rooms are already occupied. The surgeries are ongoing there. Then what happens? That this patient should wait. This emergent or urgent patient should wait. And it has been documented that this waiting time increases, on average, increases mortality by over 20%.
Just because of the delays?
Just because of the delay for emergent and urgent surgeries.
This is for emergency planned surgeries, right?
Yeah.
Wow, that's a big number.
Big number. Besides, the length of stay of such patients who already deteriorated before the surgery would be significantly longer, about 1 day. And 1 day increase of the length of stay, you're talking about the multi-million waste for the hospital.
Just 1 day?
Just 1 day. But that's not it. Let's talk about patient placement. So you're a surgeon and you perform a wonderful procedure.
Yes.
So that is what happened in 2000 with a teenage boy in South Carolina. I read a lot about this boy and learned from his mother about that. Very talented person. I would say unusually talented. I could elaborate. I just don't have the time to talk about all his talents.
Yes.
So he's supposed to do the surgery on Monday in 2000. However, on Monday in 2000, it was Halloween. So he asked his parents to reschedule his surgery on Thursday. And they did. But on Thursday, the hospital is already full. The hospital is being emptied on the weekend, so surgeons have access to the beds. But on Thursday, the hospital is full. So he's supposed to go to thoracic surgical ward. There was no bed there, it was a peak. So he has been placed in the pediatric oncology. That was Thursday. After very successful surgery, he started complaining on abdominal pain.
Yes.
Nurses there have not been trained in thoracic surgery, and they were not able to accurately diagnose the problem. Besides, as I mentioned to you on Friday, Saturday, there is no attending surgeons, only residents.
For the listeners, explain the difference between attending.
Residents are those who are still in the process of training.
Okay.
While attending surgeon is typically a good one with multi-year practice.
Okay, so one's an expert and one's kind of
Exactly. And that was the surgeon who operated on his Louis Blackman. This boy named is Louis Blackman. So after successful surgery, to make a long story short, after successful surgery on Thursday, the boy died on Monday.
And the cause is because?
Two causes. One, those peaks that makes hospitals overcrowded.
Yes.
And second, that the surgeons are absent on weekend.
Because if his attending physician had been there during the week, they were more skilled and they knew the patient better as well.
Yeah, and they would recognize the problem.
So the issue of managing the operations seems to be the foundation on which everything sits here.
Yeah. Now, let us look from the position of patient. Every patient who are trying, or her loved ones, supposed to undergo surgery, how they approach this problem. They are looking for a good surgeon that their friends, relatives, neighbors could recommend, right? And the surgeon who operated on Louis Blackman was very good.
Yes.
So even after successful surgery, you are not guaranteed that you're not going to follow the footsteps of Louis Blackman. I would say unless you come home from the hospital, you cannot say that your surgery was successful. Two reasons.
Yes, because there could be complications thereafter, like what happened here.
Absolutely. The patient, for two main reasons, I would say, beside of surgeon absent there. First is patient misplacement in the wrong ward. And that's what happened to Louis Blackman. And that surgeons are very angry when it happens, because surgeons are doing miracles, in my opinion. I worked with many. They're doing miracles. And after that, somebody ruined that, and the patient dies. They're very angry. So that is this kind of stick associated with this type of schedule. But two other reasons are, again, wrong patient placement, the wrong floor. And the second one is number of patients per nurse.
Yes, we've discussed that earlier. The ratio is way out of control.
Yeah, if the nurse is taking care of many more patients than she should, then the chances that the patient would have a different outcomes, increases. Just a couple of numbers. Study by Linda Aiken, they studied, and colleagues from Pennsylvania, they studied 300,000, if I'm not mistaken, surgical patients, and they figure out that one nurse per 4 patients is safe in post-surgical unit, after surgery.
But does that actually happen, 1-4 ratio?
You're asking professional question, rarely.
Rarely. I've not seen that.
Correct. But what they documented, then each additional patient, so for example, nurse taking care of 4 patients, this is safe. But then nurse taking care of 5 patients, the mortality, extra patient would increase the mortality for all 5 of those patients by 7%. Extra 2 patients would increase it by 14%, etc.
But there's obviously the cost component of having more nurses. And the second one is they're suffering from burnout. There's not enough nurses.
We can pay either with money, with funds, or we can pay with wise management. We can pay with smoothing those schedule. And when you even those schedule, the results are astonishing. I can tell you, the book, the results are astonishing. I just want to show you the book that is going to be published that requires the story of Louis Blackman and several others. There is a solution to that. When you smooth those peaks, when you help surgeons to smooth those peaks, they're receptive when they see the outcomes. Look what happened at the Cincinnati Children's Hospitals, for example. They significantly increased surgical volume. Significantly. It's like, again, a highway. If you send from point A to point B, 20 patients, then 100, then 0, then 10, you will have a throughput. You will send many fewer patients, many fewer cars, I should have said, than if you send them in a steady state flow. So at Cincinnati Children, they dramatically increased their surgical case volume, treating more kids. And financially, they benefited. They reported $137 million a year plus.
And this is purely around operations management of smoothing.
Purely on this intervention. And that is in public domain. Besides, in order to accommodate those artificial peaks that we discussed, they already budgeted a new tower, bed tower, of 75 beds for the cost of over 102, if I'm not mistaken, million in capital cost.
So by smoothing out the peaks, they increase their cash flow, which allowed them to increase their capacity.
Yeah, and they actually abandoned this tower, already budgeted.
In terms of what they did with nursing, did they do anything different with nursing, staffing ratios?
Very good question. Thank you for asking. Another hospital that we were working with is the Mayo Clinic in Florida. When you talk about nurse shortage, not all nurses are equal. There are nurses that is more difficult to get, even if you're ready to pay.
Yes.
And those are typically intensive care, but even more operating room nurses. Why? Because they work like a team with surgeons and anesthesia. Yes. And if a new nurse comes, it takes time for them to become an efficient team.
Yeah, it makes sense.
So even if they have money to hire the traveling nurses, it would take time before they would get back to normal efficiency.
Before they learn how to work with their team.
Exactly. So what happened at the Mayo Clinic, Florida, in the very first year, they have not even completely smoothed the peak. There was another intervention that kept the nurses there. Their nurse retention increased by 43%. 43 fewer nurses were leaving operating room. That's a big number.
That is a very big number. And is it also a situation where nurses sometimes move if a surgeon they're working with moves?
I'm not familiar. I cannot elaborate on that. That I don't know.
Fact is, it takes time, even if you can hire the nurse, to get them to work the way they've always worked, because they need time to integrate into their teams. And that's a process you cannot force.
And I would say that in this case, the efficiency of this process may not be the only downside. Another parameter would be the quality of the surgery. If you have a nurse who never worked with surgeons or anesthesiologists, I do not know how it would affect. I've never seen the publication, so I don't want to speculate, but I would assume that that would affect the quality of surgery as well.
If we think about it as a team sport in inverted commas,
exactly,
teams take time to form. They don't just form immediately.
Exactly.
And there are many things that cannot be communicated. So you observe and you try to predict what's going to happen.
Exactly.
So that's not something you can ever write down in a rule book, because every surgeon is going to do things differently.
Absolutely.
And teams naturally compensate for weaknesses other team members have. And you only will know that after working with someone over a few operations.
So again, there is a solution to that in details with multiple case studies discussed in the book with the hospital CEOs who were exhibited real leadership and did that. At one hospital in Canada, they reported in the first year annual life saving of 40 patients per year, 40, attributed to this intervention.
So it can be done. It's not easy. What's very fascinating to me is when we talk about healthcare, when we talk about any sector, I speak to many executives, everyone tells me my sector, my company is unique. But then when you start digging into the issues, it's the same issues come. There's issues around operational management. There's issues around financial discipline. There's issues around understanding that a lot of the things cannot be documented because humans make human decisions and you have to watch them. And it's the same thing is happening in healthcare as well.
I can tell you our approach to this problem is exactly what you just mentioned. We want to make sure that every party is going to benefit. Surgeons benefit, and in this book you will see their opinion internationally from not just US, but Canada, UK. Prominent surgeons commented on their experience once this has been implemented, these interventions of smoothing. Nurses are happy, as I just gave you an example. Fewer of them live in the hospitals. Physicians are happier. Emergency department patients and physicians and nurses are happier because they do not have to board dozens of patients who are supposed to be admitted, but there is no bed for them because there was a peak in scheduled surgery. So everybody benefits, including hospital chief operating officers, I should say.
Yes. Eugene, thank you so much. I thoroughly enjoyed that. I think that is one of those episodes where you come in assuming you know the layout of the land, and then you realize it's very different from what you assumed it would be like. So I want to thank you for that.
Thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure to be here.
I'm sure we'll be in touch again soon, because I think this episode is worth having a follow-up in terms of how some of these things are done.
Thank you. We'll be happy to continue.
Take care, Eugene. Have a good day.
You too. Bye-bye.
As we wrap up, today's podcast is sponsored by strategytraining.com. If you want to strengthen your strategy skills, you can get the overall approach used in well-managed strategy studies as a free download. Go to firmsconsulting.com/overall approach. And if you're looking to advance your career and need to update your resume, you can get a McKinsey and BCG winning resume template example as a free download at www.firmsconsulting.com/resume PDF.